Hello, welcome to Code Snippet. So in this video, we are going to cover the Spring annotations. So we are actually going to implement a Spring Boot project, and while implementing whatever annotations we are going to encounter, I will explain those annotations and I will highlight the use case of each annotation. So this is going to be a fun video. So sit back, relax and enjoy the show. So let me bring up the agenda over here. So if you can see here, these are all the annotations that we are going to cover in this video, right? Now there are a lot of annotations inside Spring. However, we are going to cover these many annotations inside this video. In subsequent videos, we are going to cover more annotations. So these annotations will mostly come when we are writing a REST APIs. So let's get started with these annotations. So here I have a Spring Boot project basically. So if I go inside source main, you will find only one class over here, which is main application class, right? So let me create a couple of packages basically. I'll first create a controller package because we are going to actually add the controllers, right? So let's first see the controller, right? So let me create a new controller over here. Let's call it as a employee controller, let's say, right? So there we go. We have one class created and let's mark it as controller. This is the first annotation we are going to talk about. Now, whenever we want to mark certain class as a controller, we can annotate it by using @controller, right? Now, what is a controller class? The controller class is a class where we are going to write our actual APIs, right? So the API request which is coming from outside your application will first land inside this controller, right? Based on the mappings we are going to do. So if I explain the controller, let's go ahead and let's try to visualize it. So basically, let's say here you have your user, right? So let's say here you have your user and this is your entire application over here. Let's say this is your application, right? Now your application will be running on certain server, right? So let's see, this is your server. Basically, let's say you have Tomcat or any server, probably a JBoss server, or it can be Jetty. Now, whenever a user is sending a request to your application, it will first land inside your server, right? Now what this server will do, this will transfer the request to the next component. What is the next component inside your application? The next component will be something called as dispatcher servlet. So whatever request is coming from your server, it will first land in dispatcher servlet inside your application. What is the job of dispatcher servlet? It will find out the controller for you, which controller consists of that mapping. So let's say user is calling /getEmployee. Now the moment dispatcher servlet get this request, it will try to find out the controller in which this particular request is mapped, right? So this dispatcher servlet will use handler mapping to figure out what all controllers are there, right? Because there can be 1,000 of controller inside your application. We only want the controller in which this request mapping is mapped. It will try to find out this mapping inside the respective controller, right? And how we are going to mark a class as a controller by using @controller annotation, right? So here, the moment we mark this class as controller, dispatcher servlet can find it out and it can map the request coming from user to the respective controller, right? So that is the use of controller annotation, right? Now let's go ahead and add a API inside this controller. So let's add a get API first. So what I will do, let's say public, let's say this API will return string and we will say get employee, right? Let's say we are returning just an employee from here. So in the URL which user is going to send, there will be some kind of mapping, right? For example, /getEMP, right? So in order to add that mapping, what we need to do here is, so here we need to add RequestMapping annotation, right? So what RequestMapping annotation will do, it will have a path basically to which we can map our incoming API to, right? So let's say we have get employee over here. Let me put a slash over here. So this mapping, once the user will hit this mapping, the dispatcher servlet will find this controller and call this particular API, right? So that is how we can make use of request mapping to map the request with particular path, right? This is a get endpoint. So which HTTP method we are going to use over here? So for that, we need to write a method as well. So here we will add a method saying request method dot get, because this is going to be a get call, right? So that's why I have added get, right? So that is the use of request mapping. So far we have seen controller and we have also seen request mapping, right? Now this particular API we are adding will not actually return a body, right? Once this API is called, what this will try to do, as we are returning employee, it will try to find something like like employee.html file to render it on UI, right? Because it will think that is Spring MVC and we need to render some kind of UI as a response, right? But that's not what we want to do here. What we want to do, we want to return a response body as a JSON or whatever format we want, right? So in order to do that, what we need to do is we need to annotate this as a response body. So the moment we annotate it with the response body, so it will return this particular string as a JSON or whatever format you want to user, right? Instead of rendering any UI page. So that is the use of response body annotation. Response body will just indicate that the response of this API should be a body and not any view, right? So that is the use of response body. So response body also we have seen. Where is that? There we go, right? Now let's say there are many APIs inside your application, right? For example, this is one API and let's say there are multiple APIs, right? And all of these are REST APIs, okay? All of them are going to return a response body, right? But here what we need to do is we need to annotate each function with response body because everyone is going to return some kind of response body, right? So instead of annotating every function with response body, what we can do is, as we know that this controller is serving as a REST controller, we can actually go ahead and convert this guy to REST controller, right? So let me just import this. So the moment I do that, I don't need to annotate any function with response body. Rather, I can remove that. And the API will still return response body only, right? It won't render any UI. So that is the use of REST controller annotation. So REST controller annotation is basically the combination of your @controller plus your response body, right? So if someone is asking you what is the difference between these two, you can highlight that, because if there is certain controller which is only going to return the data and not going to render any UI, then we can directly go with @REST controller rather than going with controller, right? So that is the use of REST controller annotation. Now that also we have covered. Now let's go ahead and check all the mappings, right? So before looking into that, let's create one class for our employee, which will be our employee object basically. So let me create a package as, let's say, entity, and I will create a new Java class, let's say employee over here. And here we are going to add, let's say, name of the employee, let's say employee ID we are going to add, and let's add department as well, right? So let's just keep these three fields for now. So let's go back to our controller and add one more API basically. So let's add one API for add employee. So to add the employee into database, let's say. So what we will do here, we will do public string and let's say add employee, which will actually take employee, and let's say return some string, right? What we will do that, okay, employee is added, okay, we will return for now, and I will add same thing over here. So now the request mapping will change to, let's say, add employee, and this will be post in this case, because in order to add the employee, we will post the data from your postman inside the request, right? So post is the HTTP method that we use to add the data inside your database, right? Now same thing we can do for, let's say, update as well. What we can do is we can do update employee. Here we can add, let's say, put, right? And here also I will change to update, right? Here I will say that employee is updated, right? And same for delete. So I will add one for delete as well. So here I will say delete employee. Here I will use delete method, and I will update this to delete. And here what I will do, I will say delete it, right? So we have successfully added 4 endpoints over here. So now each time in the request mapping, what I need to do is I need to pass the method explicitly over here, right? At which method I want to use, right? If it is a get, use get. If it is a post, use post. If it is put, use request method dot post. You need to take care of everything, right? But instead of writing this request mapping, what you can do is you can directly write a get mapping. Let's say I will add a get mapping over here, and I will just add the same path, like get employee, right? So get employee is specialization of request mapping in order to make use of get method of HTTP, right? So if I go inside your get mapping, if you see, it will be a request mapping only, but the method will be defined as get. you don't need to explicitly take care of it, right? You just need to use get mapping because the name suggests it will be a get method, right? So if I go back here, now we can directly remove this and just use get mapping, right? Same thing you can do with all other mappings. Let's say here you can use post mapping and add this path over here, right? And directly remove this guy, right? If you go inside post mapping, you will see that they have explicitly added request mapping and defined a method for us. So we can directly go ahead and use post mapping, right? Same with put and delete we can do. So the request mapping we have converted to these kind of mappings. So get mapping, post mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, right? And inside this particular mapping, the request mapping will be taken care of along with the method that we are going to use, right? So if it is delete, it will be delete, right? So like that you can make use of these mappings. So we have covered these 4 as well. Now let's proceed and let's discuss request parameter, right? Before that, REST controller we have already covered, so I'll mark that. So let's see what is request parameter. So let's say there is a endpoint where we want employee by using ID, right? So if you go inside employee class, let's say, then here there is a employee ID, right? So I want to get employee by employee ID, right? So let's say I have another get mapping over here, right? Then I will just say get employee by ID, let's say, and here also I will cover, right? Now here we want employee by ID, right? So when the user is calling this API, user should send some kind of ID, right? So that we can check if the employee for that particular ID is present in our database and we can return it to the user, right? So in order to get the employee, what we can do is we can take it in this function, let's say integer ID. So let's say employee ID. So integer employee ID I'm taking from the user, right? But this will not do the job for us. What we want it in the request, right? So in order to take it in the request, what we need to do is we need to mark it as RequestParam. So when we annotate employee ID by using RequestParam, so we are going to accept whatever request parameter user is going to pass to us, right? So that is the use of request parameter, and this request parameter will come in the request like this. So for example, here I have get employee by ID, right? So this is the request basically. Let's say it is a get request, right? And here in the param, let's say we will pass employee ID and we will just say the value, right? So we will just mark the value, let's say 1 or 2 or whatever the employee ID is. So the moment we send, when the request will reach to our controller, it will try to map that ID with this employee ID. Okay, the name should be same, right? So if you want to give some other name, we can give it over here. We can give some other name over here. So let's say name equals to I just want to pass, let's say ID over here. So what I can do, I can go ahead here and I will just say ID. Okay. And this ID will automatically be mapped to this employee ID that we have over here. And if you don't give anything over here, it will expect that the name of the parameter is same as this one, right? So it should be employee ID only instead of having ID, right? So I will just go ahead and change it over here, right? And as you can see in the URL, it will be after question mark, right? So after question mark, whatever parameters we have, we will accept that by using request parameter, right? So that is the use of request parameter annotation. So I will check this as well. This also we have covered. Now, as I mentioned that this parameter we are going to take it as a query parameter, right? In Postman, we give query parameters here, right? Now let's say I don't want to pass it as query parameter, rather I just want to pass it as a path variable. So you would have seen some APIs like this, right? So it will just be in the URL and it won't be any query parameter, right? So in this case, how we are going to accept it? So in this case, instead of using request parameter, we need to use path variable. Okay, so let me create some other endpoint probably so that we can save this code. So here I will create get employee by path ID, I will say. So whenever we want to accept that inside your path variable, we need to define it inside your URL. Employee ID is going to come inside URL, right? So as we have seen here, so it will be, so here also I will update that path, let's say. As you can see here, get employee by ID slash we have employee ID, right? So same mapping we are giving over here. So get employee by path ID and slash we are giving employee ID. So this is a parameter that we are passing from your request URL, right? Now, in order to accept that, what we need to do here is we need to annotate that with path variable. Okay. So the moment I do that, whatever path variable we have here will automatically be mapped to this integer over here. Okay. So this employee ID will be mapped to here, and accordingly we can process it, right? And here also you can pass the explicit name to it, let's say ID. Then this particular name you will need to give inside this parameter and it will still accept it, right? So that is the use of path variable, right? So let me check that as well. Now next, let's see request body, right? Now we have add employee over here, right? Now let's say, let me create one more API over here. Let me just duplicate it. And what I will do, I will say add employee, right? And this is going to be a post mapping, let's say. Now in this case, we will need to pass the employee, right? So we will need to actually create a JSON. We'll need to pass name to it, right? Let me create that JSON quickly over here. So your JSON will look something like this, and we are going to map it with the employee class that we have created, right? So what we have string name, employee ID and department over here, and same thing I'm giving over here, right? So whenever we send this request, this JSON will be sent along with that, okay? And this JSON we need to catch in our employee object, okay? So in order to do that, request body annotation will come into picture. So the moment I say request body, whatever body we are passing from here will automatically be mapped to this employee object, right? And we can process this employee object further. So that is the use of request body annotation, to take the JSON and convert it to your employee object. Whatever JSON coming from the user, we will accept it inside our object, right? And the object will be mapped to this class, and these fields will be populated accordingly, right? So that is request body annotation for us. That also we have covered. Now those are annotations which we pretty much use for, REST APIs, right? So let's get started with these 4 annotations now. So these are basically core annotations inside your Spring Boot. So let's see what are those. So what I will do here, I will create a new package, let's say service over here, and let's create a service class. Let's name it as employee service, right? Now here in this class, we are going to add all our business logic, right? That means this class will act as a service, right? So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to add few methods like public string, let's say, and I will add get employee, and here I will just return a employee, let's say, for now. Let's say the call is coming to your controller, and your controller is calling your service, which is fetching the data from the backend, right? And it returning to the user, right? I'm not actually implementing the code now. I will just return some dummy string from here. This particular class is going to act as a service, right? And this is just a class, right? So to initialize the class, what we usually do is we create an object of this class, right? So employee service, we will say employee service equals to new employee service, right? But in the Spring, we don't need to do that. What we need to do is we need to mark this class as a service, let's say, in order to convert it to a Spring managed bean, okay? So service is basically annotation, which is specialization of your component, right? So if you go inside your service, you will see that it's a component, okay? What is the component? The moment you mark a class as component, that particular class will be managed by Spring, right? So what that means is you don't need to go ahead and create an object of it, right? So here you don't need to go ahead and say employee service E equals to new employee service, right? The initialization of that object will be managed by Spring. At the moment you mark a class as a component, that particular class will be managed by Spring, right? And that particular class will be converted to Spring managed bean, right? So service is basically annotation, which is a specialization of your component, so that we can indicate that this particular class is having some kind of business logic, that this particular class will act as a service and will do most of the business operations for us, right? So that is the use of service and component annotation that we have. So basically service is a specialization of your component only. So in other words, if I just replace this with component as well, so that will also work, and it will work in same way, right? But we want to mark it as a service because we know that this particular class will act as a service and have some kind of business logic, right, from the backend, right? So in order to identify that this particular class will contain our business logic, we will mark it as service, right? Now what I'll do, I'll create a new package, let's say repository, or let's say repo. Now here I will add a new class, let's say employee repository, and let's say this employee repository is also going to have this method which will actually do some kind of DB operation, and it will get the employee for us from the DB and return the same employee, right? I'm just returning string over here. Now we know that this particular class is going to talk to DB, right? So we know that this is a repository class. So we mark it as a repository. Now you go inside repository, you will also see component annotation here. So repository is another specialization of your component only, right? So it's a Spring component only. Same thing goes for repository as well. It will just convert your class to a Spring managed bean, and it will indicate that this particular class is going to talk to DB and fetch the data from DB and will have a direct interaction to DB, right? So that is the use of repository annotation, and that's how we can use it. So it's basically a component only. Same thing, if you directly mark it as a component, that will also work in same way, but we want to indicate that this is a repository, that's why we will mark it as a repository, right? Now we have covered component, service and repository as well, right? Let's say you have your controller, you have your service, right? But how I'm going to call my service from my controller, right? So what I can do is I can define my employee service over here. Now what I want this employee service to automatically be injected when we bring up our application, right? That Spring will do for us. So in order to inject it automatically, what we need to do is we need to mark it as Autowired, right? So the moment we do that, the Spring will inject this dependency for us. Now let's say, now what we can do is we can actually call the backend service, but we will say employee service dot get employee. So what it will do, it will go inside your service layer and it will return this employee, right? Now this service also don't have idea about this employee, right? So what it will do, same thing we will do here as well. We will define employee repository here and we will inject it by using Autowired. And here what are we going to do is we will say employee repository dot get employee. It will in turn go to this guy and this guy will return this employee to us, right? It will go back to employee service and employee service will return this to controller, right? That is how we can inject these objects, right? So are we creating the instances of these objects by using new keyword? No, we are not. What we are doing, we are just defining it and we are making use of Autowired annotation, and Spring dependency injection will inject these dependencies automatically for us, right? Now this Autowired annotation you can use at multiple places, is called as field annotation. There are a couple of more, constructor annotation and setter annotation, that I will cover as a part of another video. So that is the use of Autowired annotation to inject the dependency inside your classes, right? So that also we have covered. So we have covered all these annotations in this video. So that's it for this video. I hope you have basic understanding of all these annotations by now, and I will come back with another set of annotations in the next video, so stay tuned. So if you don't want to miss that video, just hit the red button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for watching. See you in the next video.